as I imagine you all know perfectly well, any serious and solemn celebration in the Middle East is an occasion of formality and careful organization. Every detail of an important meal eaten with invited guests has its own significance. Where you sit, what you eat, the order in which the meal is eaten, all is filled with meaning. Alone among the gospel writers, John does not identify the Last Supper with a Passover meal. He begins chapter 13 by saying quite clearly, now it was before the Passover of the Jews. Also in John's account of the Last Supper, the central act is the washing of feet, not the breaking of bread, the giving of the cup, the identification of it with his own body and blood. So why does John differ from the other gospel writers? Why does he not associate the Last Supper with the Passover? Well, like so much Bible criticism, we're in the realm of conjecture. But one theory gives a clue to Jesus' mysterious words at the end of the reading we've heard just read. And that's the word glory. But actually, the glory comes with the crucifixion and resurrection. And it might be the case that for John and for John's community, the Eucharist can only ever be celebrated in the light of the new creation. That through crucifixion and resurrection, something new has been brought to birth. So the Eucharist is celebrated, as a theologian puts it, in the mysterious trinity of wonder, doubt, and joy, in which the disciples and the church were admitted into a new and indestructible communion and community with their Lord. So that might be why John does not identify the Last Supper with the hours of darkness and night before the crucifixion. It might be that for John, the Lamb of God, Jesus, bringer of a new covenant, must be celebrated Eucharistically, having passed over from death to new life. Which would explain a little bit why tonight's gospel has darkened tones of betrayal and night. For John, perhaps, the Eucharist is properly located in the place of resurrection joy. So first question for you tonight. Remember, the past few nights I've been asking you about what it is that has taken you back as a fragrance to God. Or how do you perceive or truly see? So tonight, when you taste, as you all do so often, the simple gifts of bread and wine, is it for you a moment of resurrection? Does it become wearyingly familiar, taken for granted? If for John's community it's a moment of resurrection joy, that Eucharist, is it for us? Is it the most radical thing that we do as human beings? At that altar, the Queen of England, next to the homeless beggar, the same fragment of bread, the same sip of wine. Do we taste the kingdom? So familiar to us, week by week. Is it worth being woken up and reminded? For John, the Eucharist is a resurrection encounter with the crucified and risen Jesus. So, if it's not the Last Supper, nevertheless for John, what we've just heard about is a meal of great significance because all the signs are there. The table is set. The guests recline on their left side, leaving their right hand free to eat. And the conversation gives us a bit of a clue as to what order the principal guests are in. Jesus, as the host, lies in the center of the table. Next to him, in the place of greatest honor, lies the beloved disciple, who would have been on Jesus' right hand so as to be able to lean onto his breast. And that would have left the place on the left hand, another place for a guest of honor, free. So who is lying there? And don't say Simon Peter. Because if it was Simon Peter, he would have had to lean across Jesus to ask the secret question, who is it who's going to betray? So maybe Simon Peter is at a right angle of the table or next to the beloved disciple. And the ability of Simon Peter to motion to or poke on the shoulder the beloved disciple to say, who is it that he means, makes sense of that. And if they're close together, it makes sense of the fact that the other disciples don't quite know what's going on. So my question again, who's on the left-hand side? The other place of honor. Again, we're in the realm of conjecture, but is it not at least reasonably possible to conjecture that it might be the person who organized the meal? Who organized the meal? The person who kept the common purse. Who kept the common purse? Which makes it all the more understandable about the dipping of the bread into the dish. Because that's what you do to a guest of honor. You give them a morsel, if you're the host, from the dish as a sign of honor, as a sign of love, as a sign of intimacy. Did you ever think of it like that? You probably all did. You're very wise and experienced. But when he receives the fragment of bread dipped in the dish, it's the sign of honor, of intimacy and love. And it's at that moment that Satan enters into him. Why? Terrible disappointment made so visible precisely because of being given that morsel of honor. Has it been the mounting up of a series of events, misunderstandings, resentments, that has so filled Judas with resentment and disillusionment? Did he expect one kind of Messiah and get another? We shall never know. But it seems that for John, that moment of love is the key significant. There is an element of a Eucharistic moment there, one for which the recipient is unworthy. Second question, how often have you and I come to the table of mercy and hospitality, the table of radical welcome, only too aware of our own unworthiness to receive the sign of honor from the dish? Or maybe another question, to what extent have we expected one thing from our faith or our church or our friends and then felt utterly let down when the reality has not met our expectations? How much of Judas' inner turmoil has been present in us? Perhaps part of the Satan entering into Judas is that while he feels one thing, he outwardly has to appear to live out another. He's at the table, the place of greatest closeness. But he's tipped over the edge, and Jesus knows this, and so tells him quietly to go quickly and do what he must do. We'll never know that maybe up until that moment there was the possibility for a different outcome for Judas. But no longer. But I take such comfort in the religious traditions, the orthodox among them, which honor Judas as an agent of the work of our salvation. For he sets in train the events that lead both to crucifixion and resurrection. All Christian traditions hold in common the potential for Judas' forgiveness and so ours. So my third question. In the resurrection moment of encounter at the Eucharist, and in the knowledge of your unworthiness, do you still feel encountered in the midst of it, fed and loved and nurtured and sent out again? Sometimes maybe, sometimes not maybe. What we have to do is to revisit the story again. We can't anticipate it too soon. And that's what tomorrow and Friday and Sunday are about. Revisiting the story to make it our own once again. We can't anticipate our salvation because it's reenacted over the next 3 days. So all we can do tonight is to wonder as the Son of Man rises and proclaims in the darkest hour that here is the moment of glory. And that's where we return to the beginning. In the way that John's community always celebrated the Eucharist, perhaps in the light of the victorious work of the Lamb of God. Now, as it is night and he enters in on his lonely road, he sets his eyes on the work he must accomplish, knowing it's the only way that the glorious work of reconciliation can be brought to birth in us. In this is glory, that God is so helplessly in love with our broken humanity that he will pursue us to the cross and death to demonstrate that love.